The alliance that held the West together for 75 years is cracking. Right now, as a fragile ceasefire hangs by a thread over the Persian Gulf, the United States and its NATO partners are locked in a confrontation that could redraw the entire map of Western military power. Trump is furious. Spain is defiant. Turkey is refusing to budge. And somewhere in the corridors of the White House, officials are drawing up plans that could change NATO forever. This is not a drill. This is happening right now. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind just a few weeks. The United States launched military operations against Iran, a move that sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry in Europe and beyond. It was the kind of decision that demands a response from allies, and many of them hesitated. According to open source analysis and multiple Western media reports, that hesitation has cost some NATO members dearly in Washington's eyes. The Trump administration expected solidarity, and what it got from some corners of the alliance was silence, or worse, open resistance. Now, that bill is coming due. Reports surfaced this week that the Trump White House is actively weighing a plan to physically relocate American troops away from NATO allies deemed insufficiently supportive, and toward countries it considers more loyal. We're talking about a potential reshaping of the entire U.S. military footprint in Europe. And that is a genuinely shocking escalation in transatlantic tensions. Let's break down what's actually being proposed, because the details here are critical. According to a report first published by the Wall Street Journal, the plan under consideration would move American forces away from countries like Spain and Germany, long-standing central NATO partners, and redeploy them eastward toward Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and Greece. Now, why those countries specifically? Reports indicate those eastern flank allies have maintained higher defense spending relative to their GDP commitments, and crucially, they were among the first to back international efforts to secure shipping through the Strait of Hormuz when the conflict with Iran erupted. That last point cannot be overstated. The Strait of Hormuz is the jugular vein of global oil supply. Roughly 20% of the world's petroleum passes through that narrow waterway. When Iran threatened to close it, or did close it, depending on which reports you follow, the response of each NATO ally was noted, filed, remembered. Now, those records are being reviewed. The proposal also reportedly includes closing at least one U.S. military base in Europe, potentially in Spain or Germany. ABC News confirmed the story while noting it remains unclear exactly how advanced these discussions are or which specific installations would be targeted. But the fact that this is circulating among senior White House and national security staff at all, that tells you everything about where this relationship stands right now. Critically, and this is important, the plan falls short of a full NATO withdrawal, which President Trump has repeatedly floated in recent weeks. A full withdrawal would require congressional approval under a law passed in 2023. What's being discussed here is something more surgical, more targeted, a punishment that doesn't blow up the alliance, but makes very clear who is and isn't in Washington's good graces. The day this report dropped was the same day President Trump sat down at the White House with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. And by all accounts, that meeting was not a warm one. Trump told Rutte, directly, face-to-face, of his, and I quote from reports, absolute disappointment with NATO's role during the conflict. Think about the weight of that phrase coming from the President of the United States to the head of the most powerful military alliance in history. Not concern, not frustration, absolute disappointment. Rutte, to his credit, did not flinch publicly. He described the session as a very frank and very open discussion. Diplomatic language that, when used by NATO officials, tends to mean it was tense, and both sides said things the other didn't want to hear. He did acknowledge that some allies had been a bit slow in providing support when the U.S. launched its operation, a remarkable admission from a man whose job is to hold the alliance together. The next day, speaking at the Reagan Institute, Rutte tried to steady the ship. He insisted that the vast majority of Europeans have complied with the U.S. demands. A conciliatory message, a bridge-building message. But back at the White House, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt delivered a very different verdict. She said NATO allies had, and this is the direct language used, turned their backs on the American people over the past 6 weeks. Turned their backs. On the American people, that is not diplomatic language. That is a political declaration of grievance, and it signals that whatever Rutte says publicly, the temperature inside this administration is still dangerously high. Now here's where this gets even more complicated, because several European governments are not backing down. They are pushing back, hard. Spain's Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares stated plainly this week that NATO will not participate in the Iran war. His reasoning? The Allies were never informed, never consulted. And pointedly, the Middle East is not within NATO's defined sphere of influence. That last argument is technically accurate. NATO's founding treaty is focused on the Euro-Atlantic area. Article 5, The mutual defense clause applies when a member is attacked, not when a member chooses to go to war somewhere else. Spain is essentially saying, we didn't sign up for this particular mission. And then there's Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, home to the Incirlik Air Base, a nation that sits at the literal crossroads of Europe and the Middle East, and whose cooperation the United States desperately needs in this region. Turkey's Trade Minister Ömer Bolat told Euronews this week that NATO allies are not obliged to assist the United States and Israel in the conflict, or to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Not obliged. Full stop. Now, Turkey's position is complex, as it always is. Ankara has its own relationships in the region, its own economic interests, its own public opinion to manage. But when Turkey, is publicly distancing itself from a U.S. military operation, the strategic implications are enormous. This is not a peripheral ally expressing mild concerns. This is a cornerstone member of the alliance drawing a very visible line. According to open source analysis, this intra-alliance rift is being watched extremely closely in Moscow, in Beijing, and in Tehran. Any perception of fracture inside NATO is, strategically speaking, a gift to adversaries who have spent decades trying to drive exactly these kinds of wedges. All of this is unfolding against the backdrop of what reports describe as a fragile 2-week ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, agreed to just this past Tuesday. 2 weeks. That's the window. That's how long both sides have agreed, at least on paper, to pause the shooting. But fragile is the operative word here. A ceasefire without a political resolution is not peace. It is a pause before the next escalation. And the conditions that produced this conflict have not disappeared. The Strait of Hormuz remains a flashpoint. Iranian nuclear ambitions have not been resolved. The economic pressure from U.S. sanctions has not been lifted. What happens when those 2 weeks are up? What happens if a ship is attacked, or a drone crosses a border, or a miscommunication turns into a firefight? The ceasefire gives both sides time to breathe, but it also gives both sides time to rearm, reposition, and recalculate. And here's the strategic problem layered on top of all of this. The United States is now managing a simultaneous crisis on 2 fronts. It's managing a shooting ceasefire with a regional power in the Persian Gulf, while managing a political rupture with its own closest allies in the Atlantic. That is a genuinely precarious position for any administration to be in. Let's zoom out and ask the bigger question, because it's one that millions of people in Europe and America are asking right now. What does this mean for NATO itself? The alliance has survived Cold War tensions, the Iraq War divisions of 2003, disagreements over Libya, disagreements over defense spending, and years of Trump's first-term pressure. It is not a fragile institution. It has deep structural roots, shared intelligence, integrated command structures, decades of military interoperability. But what NATO has never faced before, at least not quite like this, is a scenario where its most powerful member is conducting a major combat operation, expects allied support, and is openly threatening to restructure the alliance's military geography as punishment for non-compliance. If the troop redeployment plan moves forward, it would send an unmistakable message. In Washington's view, NATO membership now comes with obligations that extend beyond the Euro-Atlantic Treaty area. That is a fundamental shift in the alliance's political contract. Some allies, Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, appear willing to accept that contract. They have their own reasons, namely the Russian threat on their eastern borders, to stay as close to Washington as possible. But others, Spain, Turkey, potentially Germany, appear to be drawing different conclusions. And if that gap widens, what you get is not the end of NATO, but something arguably more dangerous, a 2-tier alliance where some members are fully inside Washington's security umbrella and others are operating at arm's length. That is a defense grid under immense pressure. And adversaries, in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, know exactly how to exploit it. Here is where we stand tonight. A ceasefire that could collapse in 2 weeks. An alliance that is openly arguing about its own obligations. A White House that is drawing up plans to move military assets as political leverage. And a set of fault lines between East and West within NATO, between America and Europe, between the demands of one war and the architecture built for another, that are widening in real time. The decisions made in the next 14 days, in Washington, in Brussels, in Tehran, in Madrid, and Ankara, could determine whether this ceasefire becomes the foundation of a diplomatic resolution or the last quiet moment before a far larger escalation. What happens next could change everything. Stay with this channel, because we'll be watching every hour.